Yo, what's up? My name is Blessing, and this is Wired. This video is going to sound kind of preachy. It's going to sound kind of maybe annoying even, because the subject matter that I'm going to be speaking on is something that I feel like so many people have touched on at this point and so many people have talked about, but I want to give my own sort of input. And so if this is something you're tired of hearing, then leave the video. It makes sense because, once again, super touched on topic. I want to see if I can put my own spin on the topic and talk about things that I feel haven't been talked about by many. And so, yeah.
I love video games, but I also have to say that games have a deep-rooted issue in that they don't value diversity, and they absolutely should. Too often we see video games with the same kind of protagonist. You know what protagonist I'm talking about, the straight white dude with brown hair. Too often we see games struggle to tell stories, and too often we see diverse groups of people struggle to find passion in video games because content in games really only afford forming a connection with a certain kind of person. Diversity matters because it creates a more realistic and immersive experience. It allows for more people to have a stronger connection to games, it allows for more varied gaming experiences, and it allows for more creative freedom, which is what I want to touch on in this video.
One of the arguments I often see when browsing through internet forums is the argument that people advocating for social justice in games are leading to the censorship of game creators.
It's an interesting argument, but the sentiment is easy to understand when broken down. When people complain about female characters in games being over-sexualized, races being underrepresented, and other social issues present in games, developers sometimes change their games in order to accommodate those who seem to take issue. But is that accommodation leading to the creative freedom of developers being compromised? This seems to be where a lot of people differ in views. One of the most recent examples of a developer changing their game because of an outcry is that of Tracer in Overwatch. Tracer is a female character in the game whom fans seem to love. Tracer is not only an awesome female character, she is an awesome character overall. This is impressive to see given that we do not get to see awesome fleshed out female characters in games as much as we do male characters. This is why some people complain about a certain pose that the character would do that seemed to be sexual in nature in a way that was out of character for her. Because of the complaints, the developers of the game switched out the pose for a different one. The changes that the developers made upset many people who believe that the game had been almost tainted in a sense, since the developers changed an aspect of the game even though the game wasn't fully released yet. It's understandable. What if I was a person who really liked Tracer's pose? What if I thought that the pose was the best part about Tracer? Because of a few people's complaints, something I love is now ruined and the creative freedom of the developers is now compromised. There are some good points to be made about how we treat art and how we treat a product that was made for a wide array of people. One thing that we don't often think about, however, is how advocating for diversity in terms of race, gender, and more can lead to better games. And not only that, lead to even more creative freedom for developers. Having initial worries about changes being made to a game is understandable. Interestingly enough, many of us only have this issue when it comes to changing the design of a character or anything that remotely has to do with social justice. We worry that when people ask for more Black, Asian, and Hispanic protagonists, that this will lead to creators shoehorning in diversity for the sake of diversity. We worry that creators will not be allowed to create freely. We don't want our game's content to be censored. But what if I told you that a developer changing an aspect of the game because of public outcry is not censorship? In the case of Overwatch, the game hadn't been officially released yet when the changes were made. Even in many other cases, developers change aspects of the games all of the time. There is the movement in Witcher 3, the balancing in fighting games, the glitches in Fallout 4, and hundreds of more cases of developers changing parts of the game that I could list due to fan feedback. In the case of Overwatch, many would argue that it was the artist's vision for Tracer's character. But what if I told you that it was the vision of CD Projekt Red for Geralt in Witcher 3 to control in the heavy manner he did originally? It was their vision for Geralt to control in a way that many players found difficult. Fan outcry made them update the game to make Geralt control better. None of us complained about the change. This type of thing happens often. Fans complain about the Gjallarhorn in Destiny being too powerful of a weapon. This led to Bungie making the weapon weaker. Bad design choices can be in line with bad mechanics. If you create a character that is jarring to the experience of a game, or that takes a player out of the immersion of the game, that's just as bad as having a mechanic that does the same thing. One of the main problems with the argument that we don't want developers making their games diverse just for the sake of diversity is the fact that we forget how desensitized we are to the social issues very apparent in games. By this, I mean that most games we play have a white male protagonist. An overabundance of games over-sexualize female characters. Many games lack diversity in characters in terms of race, gender, sexuality, and more. However, most people in the real world are not white males. Most people in the real world are varied in terms of race, personality, body type, sexuality, and so on. Different types of people groups are completely absent in many games, and the issue is that we don't see an issue. In an industry that is trying to make the push towards realism in its products, this is a glaring problem. The real world is colorful, and yet our games are often not. This is not just a social justice issue, it's a quality of product issue. And yet, we often fear that diverse characters will be shoehorned into our games against the will of the creators. Have you ever thought about how white male characters are already shoehorned into all of our games? Or have you thought about how overtly sexual female characters are forced into our games?
I had to change the female character subplot significantly. They ended up casting, in the original draft of the script, she's like sort of a chubby, smart Asian girl. And in the movie, she's played by former Victoria's Secret model Ashley Hinshaw.
Most of the publishers still wanted to change a lot of things in it. They said, oh yes, it's interesting, but maybe you should have more action, or maybe you should have a male character, or maybe you should have cutie, or stuff like that. Yeah.
And you're like, ah.
The screenwriter behind the movie Chronicle, Max Landis, spoke about the process behind making a film. Landis mentioned how he originally wrote one of the female characters in Chronicle to be a chubby, smart Asian girl. Instead, the studio changed the character so that they could cast a Victoria's Secret model. This is standard practice that takes place in producing the products that we love. We like to believe that what we are ingesting is art in its purest form. We like to believe that every aspect of the games that we are playing was conceived in the mind of an artist and created with the intent of self-expression. This is simply not the truth. Games are ultimately made for selling to the consumer and making money. Games are made with money in mind. Unless you're playing a self-published indie, every game you play has been heavily altered from the original vision. That's how business naturally works. It is the reality of game development. If you want to sell your game, you do whatever you can to create a product that appeals to the widest audience. Life is Strange's main protagonist was almost a male because of this reason. The female character in Chronicle was changed for this reason. Sexy characters and white male protagonists are shoehorned into every game for this reason. Your games are altered from a piece of art into a consumer product. This is why I firmly believe that advocating for more diversity in games will give creators the chance to be more creative in the way they approach developing their games. We should stop being fearful of how our outcries will affect the future and start thinking of ways we can be different from a past of a game's content being controlled by what the dollar dictates rather than what an artist wants to express.